I see trees of green.
First of all, look, thank you very much for the invitation to come. Rita and Tony, I first got introduced to them, I think, in 2005, and we put in 2 plantations together, and it's been a great journey. And they're very staunch advocates of farm forestry and very enthusiastic about promoting the concepts in the community. So well done to them for getting this up and running. So just a bit of background about me. And just forgive me if I take my glasses off and on. I'm getting a bit old, so I can't see things as well close up with them on. But look, we're on farm ourselves. So myself, my wife, and 4 kids. We're on a farm at a little place called Bullen, which is just north of Warragul. And we farm beef, lucerne, and trees. And I finished forest science at Melbourne Uni in 1994, and that was a great thing to do, but probably one of the most formative experiences of my career has been spending a reasonable amount of time in Africa. Been there on a few trips, and one of the roles I've gone with a group called Beyond Subsistence, which is the not-for-profit forestry aid organisation. If you want to find out more about them, look them up on the web, Beyond Subsistence, one word. And they have given me several opportunities over there. One of the things I've done over there is delivered a couple of Master TreeGrower courses, and gave me a whole new meaning of what trees meant to people. Over there in Africa, without going into too much, trees in the countries I've been to are a real symbol of hope. In Africa, when things get tough, Africans go to the trees, and when there's no trees left, as there is very few trees left in many parts of Africa, their hope is somewhat diminished, but renewed again as trees are replanted and becoming more and more a part of people's farms. So in 2017, I started a business called Just Add Trees, which really built on that African experience, but was really built around a platform called multi-storey farming. We'll learn a little bit more about that later, which really was a culmination of my 25 odd years experience in extending principles of tree growing to farms. And so yeah, we'll talk about a bit about that later. But I've got a waiver, and that is, I always say this to people when they're coming through our farm, and that is, this will sound bad really, because I'm up here trying to teach you, but I'm not, the world's best expert on trees, nor am I'm even less an expert on farming. So what I'm here to do is just to show you some of my experiences, but also building on the wonderful experiences of Rowan Reed, who no doubt you've met already, and just to show you more about what trees can do, what is their potential, and how can they improve land use, improve your farm, create opportunities for you. One of the key things I want you to think about today, you'll learn a number of things about managing trees. There's no point in managing trees, or very little point in managing trees, if you don't have an objective. Before you put your trees in, you need to think very carefully about what you want them to achieve, because they can do lots and lots of things for you with our intervention, but they can also do some things, that's the wonderful thing, without our intervention. I often tell people that we've got 4,500 new employees on our farm, and it's the trees we planted over the last few years. If you plant it right, the multi-purpose benefits they can provide you will just blow your mind. So that's the context I want to present this to you, trees to you today. So this is a little bit of multi-storey farming. This is actually on our place, and this was probably in 2016, this was the worst paddock on our farm. So it was pretty ordinary pasture species, mainly mainly bed grass and couch grass, and cattle never did very well on it. And I had this particular idea based on a demonstration site that we were fortunate enough to be able to put in another part of the farm, which looked at growing trees at wider spacings, but using the inter-row space, not just focusing on the trees, but using that inter-row space. And when we, a year into that trial, we planted, let's say, 20-25 varieties of pasture and in blends within the trees in this demonstration site. And I was blown away by one species in particular, and that was triticale, a cereal crop, which was grown in between the trees, and it was about this high, beautiful long heads on it, and the trees are just sitting beautifully, nestled in these little weed-controlled spots in between the triticale and the next crop. And it made me realise, for years, I just never really thought about the potential of the space in between the trees. I hadn't really thought about it holistically. Now, one of the other species that did really well was lucerne. Now, so this is a lucerne crop, and that's I've just got on the mower conditioner, and I've mown part of that, and that's actually just this last season, and it's been an amazing journey. This multi-storey farming one, because just on that side alone, we're producing 40 tonne of lucerne product over 3 cuts, sometimes 4 cuts over the lucerne season, and when we're not cutting it, we're actually grazing it. And it's growing wood at the same time. And I just put that up there as a principle to you, in that this system makes use of some resources that are free to all of us. We often don't think about. It's soil and sun. On farms, we're frequently just using this much soil, sometimes maybe a bit more, but you know, a foot and a half of soil. And in some places that's all the soil we've got, but in many others, and we'll go to a spot today, later in the afternoon, where there's actually quite a lot more soil that we can use, but we don't. Why not? I'm not really sure. Trees help you use those deeper components of soil, and when trees are integrated onto a paddock the right way, with species that are compatible with the trees, you can actually use more sun. So what's that mean? If you're using more sun, what's that creating? Yeah, why? Yeah, photosynthesis. So if there's parts of our farms that have got no ground cover, they're not photosynthesising. It's that simple. So if they're not photosynthesising, they're not putting carbon into the ground. Carbon it's a big buzzword at the moment, isn't it, carbon? But carbon is at its most effective in soil and most secure at soil when it's actually stored beneath 30 centimetres. And that's where trees really come into their own in terms of assisting soil carbon sequestration or storage in soil. So I just put that up as something maybe that can stimulate a few thoughts for you as we go on. And I'm encouraging you not to just think about the trees, but think about the environment they influence beside them. This is it's actually the demonstration site that I spoke of. In terms of trees influencing space around them, and the silviculture we'll talk about later assists in this. This site, it's only just a little over a hectare. It's been an amazing learning process, this, because we found some really interesting things that are perhaps a little bit counterintuitive at first glance. And one of them is that this particular site, where we've been really fortunate to be in a partnership with Landcare, where soil components and pasture analysis have been going on there since 2016. Trees were planted in 2014. And we're finding some really interesting things. One of them is that in summer, the moisture content of that site compared to, you see a paddock off to that side. There's a control as well, so it's not a full-on trial. But actually, we've got a control, and we're doing some assessments in here, and we're finding that over the last 5 years, there's been assessed that in summer, this side is actually wetter. It retains higher soil moisture than the one over there, and it's quite significant. A significant amount. We're talking in the realms of 5 to 10% in that summer period, and that's wonderful because it means that clovers last maybe 3 or 4 weeks longer going into the summer. But in winter, it's drier. This side here is drier in winter, and clearly that's because the trees are taking the water. But if it's drier in winter, why might that be a good thing? Sorry?
Say it again, sorry.
If it's dry, if a site like this is drier than an open paddock in winter, why might that be an advantage?
Well, no waterlogging.
Yeah, less waterlogging. You can drive through your paddocks. When the cattle or livestock walk through those paddocks, they're actually not hugging it up as much. So therefore, you don't get as much bare soil moving forward, less weeds, more photosynthesis. It's been really interesting. The other thing that really there's a number of things that have stood out, and we're not exactly sure of this, why this is at the moment, where we've got some thoughts, but this pasture is actually more palatable. It has more protein, it's more digestible. So whilst over the last 7 years, on average, the pasture hasn't been quite as much pasture, say 90% of that pasture, there's 90% pasture in here, well, let's say, in terms of growth, this is 90% compared to 100% in the pasture and the control. So there's more pasture going in the control, but the pasture in here is better, and therefore our cattle are actually putting on 15 to 20% more weight in this paddock than they are on the outside. Why might that be? Yes?
Well, the trees are reacting and bringing up nutrients from underneath and recycling it, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on that is not happening out in the other paddock because the grassroots aren't there.
You're all over it. So one of the big things in the analysis is that the ash content is considerably higher, and that is certainly one aspect. And we can see a lot more fungi on this site than we can outside. But there's a number of things we haven't quantified exactly at this point. But again, yeah, just some ideas. Perhaps that stimulates a bit of thinking as to trees' potential. So silviculture. Has anyone got any thoughts about what silviculture is?
Just the management of trees for a predetermined purpose.
Did you see the next slide? You know why? John knows that because he's been practicing silviculture for decades. So we've got some real good expertise in the room. That's exactly what it is. But it's also, some people when they think about silviculture, they just think about thinning and pruning. It's much, much wider than that. John, can you repeat your definition?
It's the management of trees for a predetermined purpose. So if you're growing olives,
yep,
that's also silviculture.
That's right. Yeah. So today we're going to be focusing mainly on wood production, but a lot of the underlying principles that we use can be applied to any form of tree growing. But what I'm specifically going to try to take you back to towards the end of the presentation today is that silviculture also involves planning your plantation. It involves establishing a plantation in accordance with those plans. But most importantly, it involves a plan that links back to your objective initially. Because if you don't link it back to, if your silviculture is not linked to your objective, you're not going to achieve the outcome that you desire. It's just not going to happen. I'd go as far to say is that there's not really very many people that are lucky enough for that just to happen by itself. Yeah, it's a tree planting for a product is a long-term thing. It might be 10 years, it might be 15, and in terms of timber, it's going to be more like 20, 25. Yes, Rita?
But do you also stay flexible enough to tinker around and try out new things?
Yeah.
Rather than being rigidly planning everything to the nth degree?
Yeah. So there's two ways to answer that question, and the first one is yes, you do. And the way to remain flexible is to, you guys, I understand you guys did measurement last week, is that right? So the way to remain flexible is to do what? Measure and monitor your trees. If you're not actually keeping in tune with what your trees are doing, you're just guessing, it's actually pretty hard to adapt. Let's say you've got a really dry period, and we've all gone through those over, in terms of a climate perspective over the last 20 years. There's been droughts, there's been wet periods too. If you're not measuring your trees, you're not actually able, you're a reactive manager. You're not being proactive. So by the time you've reacted to the borers coming out of the stems of your trees, it's too late. It's just too late. But if you're actually managing your trees, you look at the rainfall figures, you can see a slight tail off in growth. Oh, right, I need to thin here, or I need to do something else here, and actually adjust to the new circumstances. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people with tree growing, they come to something like this and they think, gee, this sounds a bit hard. You know what? I'm gonna trial 20 different species in my place, because let's face it, nobody really knows what's going to do really well there. So I'll try 20 different species, right? Or I'll try planting at wide spacings like this. No one's ever done it before. Or I'll try wide and narrow, and yeah. You know what? This is the best thing about this sort of course, is that most people have actually tried this stuff. And it's about drilling down and actually going to these demonstration sites, going to a guy like John Woodley's place, going where we're going this afternoon, talking to John Coyne. Tree growing has been going on for centuries, and we sometimes, and I'm one of these people, kid ourselves and thinking, you know what? I haven't done this. This is my idea. It's new. I am really clever. I'm a genius. But we can actually save ourselves a lot of pain by actually looking at these things and actually starting at third base rather than first. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go on too. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So here's our definition of silviculture. And this is actually a scan from where we're going today, a plantation. And this is, here it is, here's some novel management. It's been done before, but just thought I'd show you, often when people thin, highly stocked plantations, they think we've got to try to get something out of this wood. You know, it might only be this big. We've got to try to get something out of it to make it all worthwhile, otherwise we're just wasting those trees. Well, this guy had a slightly different objective. So he's actually adjusted his management to suit that objective. And one of his objectives is to always be building soil as his plantation grows. So to do that, and by building soil, we're actually there's more carbon going into that soil. Instead of this being thinned for a product, it was mulch thinned. So an excavator came on this site. We realised that to thin this for firewood product, for example, could be done. It's lovely firewood, but it was going to take an awful lot of time, a lot of expense. We crunched the numbers, and this actually didn't come up too bad. Expensive initially. Oh, expensive as all heck, absolutely. But the benefits that go from a fire control perspective, a weed control perspective, a reduction in fertiliser input perspective, was, not to mention the building soil perspective, which is the big thing where he's coming from. It was a great thing to do, very worthwhile. But he was only really able to move to this point, knowing what his original objective was. Now, let's get to the nuts and bolts of silviculture. So to actually know how to manage your trees, it's really important you know how they grow. So when trees they grow two ways basically. They'll grow in height and they'll grow in girth. Yep? Sound right? Righto, so when they grow by height, they do it in two ways. One way is that right at the tip, the very tip of the tree, they'll put on new cells. Okay? So they just put on new cells at that tip. Pretty much like that. The second way is that they actually elongate these new cells. So they put the new cells down, so the new cells are there, and they actually become longer, okay? So what this effectively means is that if a tree, let's say this is just stemming of a tree, and it forms a branch here. Knowing what you know now, is that branch going to move much, if at all, from that point, that height, where it originally was budded? No, that's right, exactly right, and that's important to realise. So if you, you actually watch a tree growing up, and you see these big branches start to form, they're not going to go up. They're actually going to stay where they are. The tree's going to grow from its tip and produce new branches. All right, so we've got that bedded down. So the height, that continual production of new cells, leaves what they call a pith in the middle of your tree. Now, your pith is, and John will talk about this later, John Coyne, it tends to be a bit of a tree that isn't used for much. You know, it's actually quite a corky, sort of carroty part of the tree, and you can actually trace how your tree is formed through that pith. Now, there's a number of things that determine how tall your tree is going to grow. Now, if you're growing trees for timber, you ideally want your trees to grow tall. It certainly there's more benefits than having a tall tree than having a shorter, stubby tree. Why might that be, you think? Why do you want a tall tree?
Volume of timber pull out.
Yeah, that's one reason. So if a guy comes along, you're growing your tree, and you get to the base of the tree, you think, I'm going to put a mill over that, I'll chop it down. You do one cut, and a 30 metre tall tree falls down. You should get 4 log lengths out of that, 4 conventional log lengths, okay, so your sort of 6 metre log lengths. So for one cut at the base, you've got 4 logs. If your tree is short and stubby, you might do 1 log at the base and barely get a 6 metre log, okay. But the other big thing about a tall tree is that if you're managing the site right from a nutrition perspective and a competition perspective, you've actually got more crown. What's happening if you've got more crown? More photosynthesis. More, you've got a bigger engine. It's like, your 30 metre tree versus your 20 metre tree is your V8 versus your little 4-cylinder buzz box, right? Yeah. Okay. So, factors that determine the tree height, well, of course, you've got water supply from the tree roots. You'll often see trees in gullies growing tall and trees on hills. Yes?
I was going to say, soil determines what happens as well. It's a big factor, isn't it? Surely.
Yeah, it is. Look, soil is a big factor. And when you're growing trees, it's very tempting just to look at what's above ground, but there's an awful lot going on beneath the ground as well. So water supply is important. Humidity around the growing tip. Now, people sometimes look at trees in a lower spot versus on a hill and think, well, yeah, it's probably soil depth mainly, but actually humidity and protection of that growing tip is really important to fostering good tree growth. Mineral supply from the roots is vital, and a lot of people don't correlate that with tree growth either. Just a real generalisation is that when we're talking about minerals, For trees, we need to look at the full gamut. We don't just look at nitrogen and phosphorus. We've got to look at the macro minerals and the trace minerals. And in my experience with tree growing, I've found that you're really shooting yourself in the foot if you pay attention to, you know, 1 or 2 minerals or 3 minerals rather than all of them. For example, your trace minerals have a lot to say about how your tree is formed. A lot about its shape, a lot about its height. Your nitrogen, phosphorus, these macro minerals say a lot about its productivity, but you need to put a frame on. If you don't put you don't have a good frame or set up conditions for a good frame in your tree, you end up with these muscle trees. You know, look a bit like that short bloke in the gym, who's really like this, and probably maybe not paying attention to his, he's paying all his attention to his arm muscles and not his legs, sort of thing. Yeah, it's not the holistic way to look at it. And insects and disease. So we'll talk, Rita's actually asked me to talk a little bit about the insects and disease, so pesticides and so forth. And I'll preface that right now by saying that if you plant your tree, you match your tree to the right site, so your site species matching is best practice. And your nutrition on your site is good. You're not going to have near the insects and disease problems that some other people have. Okay, there's lots of things to talk about there, but that's a generalisation that is pretty sound. So how to grow trees taller. So someone's already talked about soils, deep fertile soils, yeah, that helps. Water availability helps big time. Shelter from drying winds is an important consideration. So you might consider your tree planting and think, you know what, I want to plant blackwood. I'm really keen on planting blackwood. That's probably the species that most people talk to me about, is blackwood. And they're great species to want to plant. It puts selenium, puts nitrogen back in the soil, beautiful timber, really lovely timber. But as a tree in a plantation, it's a really difficult one to grow. And it's difficult because people often don't know the site requirements for blackwood. So blackwood needs water 24/7. If you're not giving blackwood water 24/7, so soil water, it doesn't have to be irrigated, it's just in a spot in the landscape where it's not copping the evaporation that other areas might be getting, or it's near a creek, maybe there's trees over it, protecting it, encouraging it to grow up, and giving it a humid conditions for that growth tip. If it doesn't get those things, so it's very, very specific, it'll do a good job as a revegetation tree for you. It'll grow, it'll be a great house for a lot of wood borers, and the black poppies are just going to love you as they're ripping the tops of those trees out trying to get those borers. So, great species, great wood, does a lot for your site. If it's planted in the wrong place, if you've got a timber objective, it's going to struggle. Yeah? So fertiliser can be, we talked about nutrition, big impact on high growth, and again, insects and disease. Yep. So, let's talk about the other way that a tree grows. Alright, so we talked about the height, let's look at its diameter now. So we know what the pith is, we know that's the sort of trace of the height, the way the tree grows, height-wise. And here we go. So the tree, all of you have no doubt have seen this, you actually have these growth rings form. And they actually form, it all starts from something just under the bark. It's a yellow layer there called the cambium. So if we look at this here, you see cambium out there on your left-hand side. Next time you cut some firewood, or maybe a tree's got to come down or whatever, have a look at the disc or the stump, and you'll see your bark, but just on the inside of this bark is something that's a slightly different colour, and that's where your new wood cells form. Okay, so it actually does two things. You've got new wood cells forming and new bark cells forming, so it sort of grows out both ways. And that's where your wood growth occurs, and that's why, you know, we can see still in the landscape why they used to ring bark the trees, because they knew that all they had to do was disrupt that cambium and the tree would die. Mightn't die straight away, as we'll see in a minute, but it would die eventually. So we see here that, can you see the sapwood? So the sapwood is that light, if it's a eucalypt for example, it's a lighter coloured wood around the dark coloured wood in the middle, which is called a heartwood. So the sapwood is where the water gets to the tree canopy. So the roots take the water, the soil water, goes up the tree, all right? We have that photosynthetic reaction in the leaves of the tree and the chloroplasts, and through that reaction, we're getting we're getting sugars that are going down the bark and going back down to the roots again. Okay, so those sugars are actually what helps the wood form, and they go down to the roots as well, and that's where we get obviously there's a few of you know a bit about soil biology, where we have that trade-off between the soil biology, getting the carbon out of the root, but giving the tree the nutrients and water it needs as well. So, key message here, water goes up in the sapwood, sugars go down the inner bark. So why might a tree take a while to die if you ring bark it, just going through the cambium? Why might it take a while to die? Why doesn't it die instantly?
Well, the water's still pumping up.
Yeah, exactly. So did you hear that? The water's still pumping up. Okay, and the tree actually has reserves of sugars in the roots, you know, through the leaves, in the wood, that allow it to, you know, stay alive for a little bit longer. But eventually it'll start looking pretty sick. But it might take months. So to clarify, sugar's going down, water going up. So this is really important to realise that you saw that sapwood before. It's really like we've got a prune tree here on your left. So what are you doing when you're pruning a tree? What are you removing?
The engine.
You're removing the engine. So, you know, this tree here is a V8. Now, it's, you know, she's gone back to a, you know, 2-cylinder motor now, right? So it's actually not it's not photosynthesising as much. You've hit the growth. Well, I can see with that tree there, that tree the soil has been looked after really well. Why might I be able to tell that the soil's been looked after really well on that side? Yes.
Look at the canopy. The canopy's nice and thick.
Oh. If you can go to your trees at home and you get your diameter tape and you measure it and you hug your tree and you look up. If you can't see any sky through that canopy, that's great news. It's really, really good. Often when I do assessment in plantations, I do that. I'll measure the tree and I look up and I'm going to see a lot of sky. I can see sky. What's actually happening is the foliage on the outside, so it's my hands. Let's see my hands in the foliage. There's no foliage here. Yeah? And that's telling me that tree's got a problem. It's not able to get all the minerals it needs to get to have that full canopy, and therefore it's not photosynthesising as much as it could. So, if you've got a full canopy, like big canopy, actually that canopy area is proportional to your sapwood area in that cross-sectional look at the tree stem before. So big canopies means a lot of sapwood is driving a lot of growth. So Rowan, now, most of these slides are actually adapted from Rowan's presentation, and I've just slipped a few different photos in and a couple extras. But we're going to talk about thinning now. Rowan's a big advocate of thinning your trees as part of silvicultural management, particularly if you're looking at timber. And when he talks about thinning, he often talks about teak plantations. Rowan's got a lot of experience in teak plantations. So here we are, there's the pith. That's the heartwood. All right, I'm not going to show you what the next one. What's the light coloured one around the heartwood? Beautiful. Sapwood. What's the inner bark called? Cambium. Louder, cambium. Yep, good. Beautiful. You'll know that is bark, really. There's the growth rings, right? Thinning has a really big influence on our growth rings, the distance between them. And we're about to see that. So what's happening here? Why are the growth rings so far apart?
There's got lots of resources to it at that stage because there's not much around it.
That's right. You often see this in young trees. They've got, they're really small. They've got all these resources, so they put the resources into really good timber growth. But look, what's happening here? So they had a year there where, it's all of a sudden got a bit slower. That might have been could have been a drought. Not sure what that was. But I would suggest that it's probably been thinned at that point, so we've got more free growth. But then what's happening here? Competition's coming in big time. Look at the difference here. So if you've got a plot, you've got a growth plot that you learned about last week, and you're starting to see this, and you see it, particularly when it goes from such a big amount to a low amount, it's time to start thinking about management interventions or silviculture. So you can see here that this is actually a reading of that disc, looking at the diameter growth in accordance with those rings. And you can see that the underbark diameter is that blue line, that top one. So you can see from a cumulative perspective, it's rocketing initially, isn't it? And it actually hits about age 5 and it starts to really, really taper off. And this dotted line talks about the diameter increment each year. Look, it's pretty tough to keep a tree growing 3.5 centimetres a year. That's a pretty big ask. But it's actually going down to well less than a centimetre each year in the absence of thinning intervention. So I think you guys know what's slowing that diameter growth, don't you? Can you tell me? Why might it be slow?
It's just crowding.
Yeah, it's crowded. Yep. What? Elaborate on that for us.
Well, if the canopy drives the growth of the single tree, it's basically being spread over too many stems, because the canopy space is constrained by just how much area you've got. Yeah, great. Let me put it this way: if you've got a hectare. Who here's got cattle or sheep? You guys think more than that. Only 1, 2, 3? Righto. Yeah, I was just wondering, would more people put their hands up if they knew I wasn't going to pick on them? Okay. Alright. Well, mate, look, I'll do this anyway. So, you've got a hectare of land, so 100 metres by 100 metres. And with that hectare, you go to the sale yards at Yay, you go in there, you've got a bit of money, you need to spend it. So you buy 20 yearlings, let's say, so they're about 300 a kilo, and you put them on a hectare, right? You've only got a hectare though, but you haven't had anything on it for years. So there's grass this high, there's grass everywhere, feed all over the place. Put them there, after, you've got 20 on there, after 2 or 3 weeks, it's starting to look pretty thin. They're really putting on some weight, They're putting on a kilo a day. So actually, they put on 20, 30 kilos in that first month, and you're thinking, wow, I'm doing well here. But you don't know a lot about cattle management, and you're a bit greedy, so you think, you know what, I'll keep them there for a bit longer. Time gets away on you, things happen at home, and you come back there a year later. Fortunately, well, maybe not fortunately, your fences were in reasonable nick, but you come back there, what's likely to happen to your cattle? They won't all be there, some will have died. The ones that are there, they're going to not look very good, and you're probably very, very lucky if the RSPCA is giving you a call. Yeah? It's a the RSPCA is not going to give you a call about your trees, but if you don't actually manage them, they're not going to perform for you, from a timber perspective in particular. Unless you really, you've got a sensational site, they'll look good for longer than maybe someone else's, but they'll still reach site capacity and eventually start looking a bit ordinary.
Clinton, just on that, as the rings get closer, because it's a bigger diameter tree anyway, you could still have the same volume growth with smaller rings, couldn't you? Because you've got a bigger ring.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. And you'll actually, that's what I mean, like I talked about that 3.5 centimetre being difficult to sustain. You actually don't need to sustain it. Because if your tree is 50 centimetres in diameter and you put on 1 centimetre, it's going to be more than that 3.5 centimetres at 2 years of age anyway. Yeah? Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So there is, and this is the other great thing about assessing your trees, because you can work out over a hectare what volume you're putting on, and that's the key measure. If you 1 year you're putting on 20, the next year you're putting on 18, the next year you're putting on 16, and then all of a sudden it goes to 5, well, you know something significant is occurring. So with forestry, we can, and I'm sure Rowan will talk to you about this, we can look at single tree management, which is fine if you've just got a few trees, but if you've got a stand of trees, you need to look at it at a single tree side of things too, but at a broader scale as well, a hectare scale. So let's have a look at these trees. So this is teak. You've got a bit of an idea about growth rings here. Bit of an idea there. So which tree is? How old is this tree and that tree? You reckon? Just have a guess. So how old is this tree? Yell at it.
Depends where it's growing.
No, I don't want you to say depends where it's grown. How old is this tree? They're on the same site.
25 years? 25?
25? How old is this one?
12.
Same age. Yep. Any advances?
Less. 12, 15, somewhere
Righto. Okay, let's have a look. 60. That one is 63 years old. That one's 25. And that's just simply to do, same site, as to do with management. Isn't that powerful? How powerful is that? Like you can see, the colour of the wood's still the same. And there's some wonderful research out there that talks about the impact of pruning and thinning on wood density. Like people naturally think, it's going to have a massive impact on wood density. It does have a bit of an impact, but it's not massive. This wood here, it'd still be good wood.
But that's also the genetics of the tree. The timber, the makeup of that particular tree is going to produce that sort of wood no matter what you do. It can slow up or it can speed, or it can slow down or speed up depending on the site that it's on.
Yeah, you're right, genetics can play a role, but that's the same genetics.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, on a site that's terrific, got all the resources that it needs, and a site that's a little bit maybe not so good, the tree will slow down, but the wood will be a more tighter grain than that site that's got the terrific fertilised soil and the wonderful biota and all that sort of stuff. You'll put on the good tree rings, whereas the other guy, he'll be a little slower in growth, and his girth will be a lot tighter and a lot heavier.
Yeah. So genetics no doubt plays a role. So we're not discounting genetics at all, and John Coyne will probably talk to you a bit more about that with seed collection later. I once read it was a great quote around when you actually get trees grown, it's really, if timber's an objective of yours, it's so important that you know where the seeds come from. So if you don't pay any attention to the seed, you've actually you've put a ceiling on its potential if you didn't need to. So you spend a bit of time collecting the right seed for your trees, or getting it from someone who knows where the best seed comes from, And that little quote that was bandied around a bit was that you spend that bit of time, you can actually improve your tree growth, it's a very general statement, of 400%. So adding credence to what the fellow at the back just said. But if you can get, you know, you spend all the money on genetics, but if you don't thin, you don't prune, you'll have your 63-year-old tree here when you actually could have a bigger one at 25. Yeah.
So Clinton,
Mm.
when you're trying to breed the trees and make these decisions, is there any intelligence to be garnered from limbs pruning and actually reading the growth of the tree that way and making decisions about how it's struggling or how it's competing, or is it to look at other issues other than chopping down the tree?
Are you saying can you do other things than chop it down to seeds?
Considering the limbs rather than the trunk itself.
Oh, like, can you tell from the limbs that you might take down? Oh, I see. Oh, look, that's much harder. Yeah, no, this is like that is a better way to do that. But the best way to do it, which is non-destructive at all, is to measure your trees. Because you're seeing your trees like with your measurement. You're measuring them every year, same time of year. We're at home, that demonstration site you saw, we're measuring them twice a year, just because that's part of what the project entails. You can work out some marvellous stuff, like you can actually pretty much, you know where the growth things are going to be, because you're measuring it every year. You can also work out things like at home, everyone raves about spotted gum, and I'm sure people rave about spotted gum here too. But it's actually, it's got its issues, and we can see at home that, you know, it doesn't really like cold conditions. It doesn't like that sleety, harsh sort of weather you can get through winter. So at home, by measuring it twice, we could actually see that it was actually growing at the wrong time of year. So it was actually, because it's an East Coast tree, there's only a really small population of it in East Gippsland. Because you can see that, it's actually growing in winter, which is no good. Because it's this fresh new growth, which has just been smashed by that cold, sleety weather during the winter. So it's one of the reasons why the indigenous species you've got next to it, the silvertop, is actually killing it. It's outperforming it for growth. I'm not saying don't plant spotted gum, but by measuring your trees, you can learn a lot of other things too. Yes, Rita?
So, on your property at home, I presume, and also for Chris Thorne and Ross Thorne, how many soil pits did you dig in order to understand where to plant what? Because it appears that species selection is so important in all this.
Yeah. Look, so soil pits, I've got a slide on that later. So can we, push that question back, and I'll keep going. We're actually, just so you know, we're going to have a break in probably 15 minutes or so, and then we'll keep going. But there is a soil pit thing later. Yes.
Do you ever use or do like core sampling just to measure
into the tree? Yeah, absolutely. So I don't personally do that, but research organisations do. It's a more expensive way to go about things, but it tells you a lot of good stuff. So you can get some very good density measurements that way, for example. So yeah, you can certainly do it that way, and it's that sort of technology to do that is getting less and less expensive. But a simple way is just to, you guys been given one of these yet?
Yeah.
They're very powerful, and it doesn't cost much. So if you learn how to use it, a good way to do things cheaply. Okay, so there's your, again, Ryan's talking about teak, so you can see in the bottom here we've got stocking. So we can see that, if you're up around that 1,000 cents a hectare, well, your mean tree diameters are going to be much lower than they would be, generally speaking, if you're managing at lower stockings through the rotation. And that's an example of a teak plant. I've never seen a teak plantation look that good. Ryan clearly has, 7 years old, it's been thinned and pruned, and it would be worth an absolute fortune. So this is a bit of a pictorial representation of what thinning does for you. Not a bad one to keep in your mind. So you're starting with, let's say you're starting with your 1,000 stems a hectare, which is a fairly common forestry spacing. I'm not recommending that because it might actually be the right thing for your objective. But let's say you're starting with that. And you take out half of them, you've got 500, 600 stems per hectare left. You create an environment where they can really grow. The site resources are going to the best trees. You take out 40% of them, away you go again. And over time they get, big and fat. I know Ryan likes talking about trees that are growing fat and fast. It's important to remember that thinning, it does work in most tree species. It works in all tree species. And if this is a pine, hope you can see that pretty well, but pine is quite tolerant of competition. So it's frequently, managed up to say 14, 16 years of age, given a good thin, and then you get this free growth going again. It comes into competition, you thin it again. Often the most profitable pine plantation regimes actually thin 3 times, maybe even 4 times, but it depends on the site, the markets, and the availability of harvesting contractors is a big one. So, just to illustrate this thinning a little bit more, we'll talk about natural processes in forests, where there is trees around which, they don't all do this, but say alpine ash, which is Eucalyptus delicatensis. It actually starts, that photo there on the left-hand side, might be sitting at 1,000 stems a hectare, 100,000 at establishment, because a fire's gone through or it's been harvested and then it's aerially seeded. And then, but when it gets to 80 years of age, it's self-thinned its way down to 100 stems per hectare. Those ash species have got a marvellous capacity for doing that. And this is actually, foresters have looked at this over years and years and years, and they have worked out this, what they call a self-thinning curve. So, you can see there, 70 years of age, the natural stands are operating at much less than 1,000 stems per hectare. And what happens here is that as the tree grows, you'll get that's the self-thinning line, and we can actually say, all right, the stocking is at 1,000 stems per hectare. We're looking at diameter on the y-axis. Once the tree at 1,000 stems per hectare, that's your density, which you can easily measure with your plots that we put in that Rowan talked to you about last week. The diameter, the maximum it's going to get to before things start dying is around that 25 centimetres. You see that? Yep. Now that's an important thing to realise, that these native stands of alpine ash, mountain ash, are doing that themselves. And that's facilitating increased diameter growth as they get older. But there is implantations, you might look at that and think, well, let's just let nature take its course, let's just let the trees do their thing. Yeah, you can let the trees do their thing, but do you want to wait 120 years to get that target log when you potentially could get it earlier? Yeah? So some people, that's fine. Their objective is to maybe to plant mountain ash, alpine ash, one of those type of species. Mind you, you're going to have a ripping site to do it. Very good site to do it. And to actually make sure that you're getting good wood out of it, you're going to have to plant it at many, many thousands of hectares, because that particular tree, that's the environment it likes. It just doesn't perform particularly well from a wood quality perspective if it's planted at a wide spacing. Yes, Rita?
So on Penumbra we have a few sites where we allow self-seeding to happen. Like we have old box trees or eucalypts that do self-seeding.
Yep.
And you see a whole stand, like a little forest of young trees that come just out. So they would be self-thinning as well eventually. I presume. Should we or should we not interfere here?
Yeah, well, that again comes back to your objective, reader. So if you, let's say that happens inside your plantation. So you've actually got your remnants, and at Canberra you've got some wonderful remnants in amongst your plantation. Well, you actually can manage those self-seeded trees if you want to, providing they're within the plantation boundary. But if you want to get diameter on those trees reasonably quickly, yeah, you'll need to go into thin. There's a number of species out there, and there's a guy in the room that knows the rules about this much better than me, that will just lock up. They'll actually lock, and that self-thinning process takes a long time. And in plantations, what I've seen happen several times is you take an improved line of seed, for example. So you know it might be established as being better for growing timber. You put it on a site that it's actually not native to. Put it on that site, and think this is a great genetic resource. It'll just do what I want it to. You get hands-off approach. You let it go. Unfortunately, one day on that particular site, I've done this one time where there was some difference in soil depth across the site. We planted blue gum on it, a really good genetic resource of blue gum. I got to the top of the hill on the site next door. You nearly get that, you ever experience that feeling where, you know, all of a sudden you feel really hot because you've done something wrong? Yeah, I got to the top of this hill this day, and I saw these dead patches in this plantation after 5 years of drought, and we'd actually had done some thinning in there, but the next thinning we hadn't done quickly enough, and where the soil was thinner, the genetics just didn't matter. All the trees in those spots died. So in the 15 hectare plantation, in that 1 year, we lost 2 hectares of trees. They weren't really well adapted to the site, they weren't getting the water they needed, they'd grown very quickly early, they weren't thinned on time, bang, perfect storm, trees died. So you will get some self-thinning, reader, but sometimes it doesn't work like that. They lock up and they die. So it is important to keep thinning in mind. So that previous slide there, you know, the big, fat, clean eucalypt blobs. Rowan loves this sort of stuff. You know, he's developed a career about promoting, you know, how to grow eucalypt wood, very good wood, fat and fast. And he's doing it very well. So this is a data set that he commonly shows in his Master TreeGrower presentations. And you can see here, he's taken 150 data sets, a range of species, and you can see that there's sort of a bit of a line there, isn't there? That as the trees get older, their diameter is obviously going up. But if you add to that data set some stuff that's been thinned and pruned, look how much earlier you're getting those diameters in that data set there. That's a lot earlier, isn't it? Yeah? That's what a little bit of silviculture can do. We'll see later on today, I'm going to ask you if you remember this later. You'll see later that, see in here, see how, look, 18-year-old Eucalyptus globulus sitting at over 1,000 cents per hectare. One of the first things you'll notice about a plantation like that, and we've all seen it, is the big fat trees on the outside. They're the ones we go to, aren't we? We go, oh wow, look at this. These are so big. Yes?
It's called the edge effect.
Yeah, it's called the edge effect. But a well-managed plantation doesn't have an edge effect. It's not so well pronounced. The trees inside are as big as the ones on the outside. The ones on the inside look like this. Now, based on what we've just talked about, what's happening there? I'll ask you, what's the problem with this? Yeah, like there's issue with form. Yeah, absolutely. So that's been thinned, so the inferior trees haven't been taken out. What else is going on there? If you're standing at the base of those trees, what can you see when you look up?
Small clouds.
small crown, you know, these poor trees, like, these are these, you know, it's like the cattle we talked about before. Some of them look dead, some of them have got, you know, 10 leaves on them, some of them are actually faring okay, a lot of epicormics. So epicormics tell you that it's like a, you know, they've been to the hospital a few times, bandaged up, and they're still trying to, you know, they come back out, they're trying to grow again. It's suffering big time. So, thin to grow leaves, which equals diameter. They call this a Nelda trial. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Nelda trial. And what they actually do in the Nelda trial is that they plant the trees progressively moving to higher stockings. Now, so when you first look at that, what's your impression? What can you see? What sort of trends can you see as the trees get closer together?
Lots of competition on the right.
Yeah.
They're actually taller. Yeah.
A little bit taller?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also denser canopy.
Yeah, so there's a what you find with these Nelda trials is you often find sweet spots. Yes?
I was going to say, with the higher planting per hectare, there's a lot more stress over there than there is on the left side of the picture.
Yeah, interesting you say that. So I'll keep going. You find out where sweet spots are at particular times of the tree's growth cycle. So right here, I'm looking at this, and I'm guessing that these trees are probably 7 or 8 years old, right? There's a sweet spot happening about here. That's actually a remnant tree in the background. These are actually closer, so closer to the camera, but there's a sweet spot happening here. These trees out here, what you often find when they're planted, you know, that's really low stockings initially. How's that growth tip feeling? What are the things we need for a good growth tip?
Humidity.
Humidity. What else? How do we generate humidity?
Shelter.
Shelter. So these guys out here,
They're doing it for themselves.
they're doing it pretty tough. So as you move in here, we've got a bit of a sweet spot, and then as time goes on, this is going to look worse and worse. So this is looking at a New South Wales species, very common, called blackbutt. And you can see the higher stocking rate, we actually, clearly, as we've learned, the diameter growth the diameter is smaller. But what's interesting is this height growth. So you can see at this lower stocking, see this tail off? Yeah, so it's reached a point where it's just not happy. Blackbutt's one of these trees that really needs that protection. But it reaches a point about here, around sort of 600-700 centimetres stocking per hectare, where the height just isn't influenced at all. So that's a really important relationship for you to understand. The tighter you plant the trees, it's not necessarily the taller they'll get, right? But there is this sweet spot here to be aware of. And you can actually work to that sweet spot through thinning.
I think to myself, what a wonderful